We're told, just like back in Genesis, that the older shall serve the younger. Esau shall serve Jacob, and that is Yahweh electing Jacob in that. And then we're told, as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And this is typically read, and the way I think, taught this is that before they were born, before they'd done anything, God is saying he hated Esau back in Genesis. Is that's what's going on here, or what? How should we read this?
That's a great question. That is not what's going on here. That's a good lead-in. Because, of course, like you just pointed out, Paul is quoting Micah, right? So we're talking about the very end of Israel's history. The shape of the paragraph is Paul starts off by saying, here's my thesis statement. The word of God has not failed, right? And he gives, at least as far as I read, the shape of the paragraph. And the first half is sort of verses 7 to 9-ish, where Paul says, here's one principle. It was never lineage that determined who the people of God was. That's the Isaac versus Ishmael thing. God's people of God direction has always been chosen based on promise and relationship, not just purely on lineage. So the fact that there's something funny going on now in the first century, remember, we're always coming back to that. What's going on with first century Jews and how they're unexpectedly responding? The fact that there's something funny going on with some first century Jews now, isn't that unprecedented, because it's never been purely about lineage and genetic heritage. That's verses sort of 6 through 9. And then verses 10 to 13 is this pair of a second point, this pair of Genesis 25 and Micah saying, okay, also I want to say that it's impossible to have a people of God without God. That's what Paul's doing. I'm paraphrasing roughly, right? Because Paul's very, very fast as he goes through this stuff. But his point in the second half of the paragraph, and he hits it twice, his point is, look, you can't think that God has abandoned the people of God. If the people of God still exists, for you to be concerned about whether God has abandoned them, then by definition he hasn't, because they're still the people of God. So something else has to be going on. And that's where Paul goes in the next parts of this chapter. It can't be that he's abandoned them because they still are the people of God. You're concerned about the people of God. Therefore, they haven't become the not God people of God. There's still God in there in the mix, and something else is the explanation. That's how he ends this first paragraph in Romans 9. And it's a fun literary kind of cheeky rhetorical move that Paul does to throw together the Genesis and the Micah stuff side by side. But he's not trying to flatten them into one reference. He's not using Micah to interpret Genesis. He's making a pair of examples that are actually completely independent of each other. And it's fun and rhetorically cool that Paul is able to cite a verse in Micah that says Jacob and Esau, but he's not literally talking about Jacob and Esau there. Again, this is another one of those times where every single Micah commentary out there knows this. Every single person who's written articles on Micah knows this. It's only Roman commentary writers who don't know this. So the first one is in Genesis 25, and Paul is making this point. It's got nothing to do with what Jacob and Esau did. God's choice to make his people is focused on himself. God is the one that makes God's people God's people. God's not deciding based on anything that they've done, because they haven't done anything yet. That's exactly the point in the Genesis 25 citation. They haven't been born. They haven't done anything good. They haven't done anything unimportant, trivial. I don't like the word evil in some English translations. It says good or evil. That's not a good translation. It's like good or inconsequential. They haven't done anything good. They haven't done anything at all. But God is saying, they are not the basis of my choice. I am the basis of my choice. God is what makes the people of God the people of God. That's the Genesis 25 citation. And then the wording, like I said, can be confusing because the words Jacob and Esau occur in the Micah passage. But we're not talking about the individuals Jacob and Esau when we get to Micah. You know what? I've been saying Micah, haven't I? It's Malachi. I
I
meant to
think
say
I did
no.
that first. I said Micah and set you off on the wrong
Yeah, you said
trajectory the whole time.
Micah, and I started thinking
My
Micah.
bad.
It's Malachi. So that's why it's not 8th century BC. We're talking 6th century BC. We're talking after the exile, post-exilic.
Right.
So Genesis 25, before there was even a people of the Hebrews that would become the Israelites. Then Malachi, post-exile, the end of their entire biblical history trajectory. God is saying, or Paul is saying, from beginning to the end, God is the one that is the basis of the people of God being the people of God. And that Malachi passage is not about, like I just said a moment ago, that's not about the individuals, Jacob and Esau. That's about the nations or the religious ethnic groups of Israel and Edom. And this particular oracle in Malachi is one where God's feelings are really, really, really hurt. It's a disputation, which is a formal genre in the Old Testament where it's more than just a courtroom trial. It's more like a kitchen argument where people are screaming and throwing dishes at each other. And it starts off with God saying, I love you. I have loved you. I've got a track record of loving you. And Israel answers, oh yeah, how have you loved us? And God says, what? How can you say that? After everything, this is the post-exilic era. I'm still with you. You've gone into exile, you're back, you're still sinful, you deserve an exile 2.0, and I'm still loving you. And then all you can do is complain that I don't give you enough. And that's God's response. I've loved you, and they say, how have you loved us? And God is cut to the heart. And that's the disputation that's happening here in Malachi. And God says, I have established a covenant relationship with Israel, and I have been completely covenantally uninterested in Edom, and they have become your enemies, and I have defended you against them for centuries. So I am covenantally loyal to Israel, and I am covenantally not loyal to Edom. And that is the language of love and hate there in Malachi. And you see that language in Deuteronomy and in, I want to say, Exodus and a bunch of places in the Old Testament. Typically, that love-hate language isn't about emotions, it's not about dispositions, it's about permanent, ongoing, covenantal status. And so that language being used there in that verse isn't about, I have committed salvation to Israel and committed perdition to Edom. And so Paul is saying, by quoting Genesis 25 at the beginning and Malachi at the very end, he's saying before there was an Israel, God's faithfulness was the basis of the people of God. Even after their entire history and their track record of doing everything wrong, even continuing to do nasty pre-exilic stuff in the post-exilic era, God is still faithful to Israel even when they're not faithful, right? The first one was God's faithful when there isn't any track record yet. And the second one is God is faithful even when there is that awful track record behind them. From beginning to end, Paul says, God has been faithful, and God's involvement is what makes the people of God. So at the end of this paragraph in Romans 9, 6-13, whatever else is going on, God's abandonment is not one of the issues on the menu.
Right. At this point in the history with Malachi, Edom has been attacked and nearly destroyed. And so there's kind of this picture of like, look, you guys, I've shown my loyalty and loved you because you guys are, just like you said, in existence. Esau's not. Edom's gone. So that's, if you want to see hate, that's hate. I don't hate you. I'm sticking with you.
That's right. That's exactly the complaint that God has in Malachi.